I've always been a person who finds comfort in isolation. That's why Lily and I moved to a rental property on the edge of the Redwood National Forest, a good 40-minute drive from the nearest town in Northern California. The house was a glass-heavy, mid-century modern structure that looked beautiful during the day, but felt like a fishbowl of shadows once the sun dipped below the tree line. Because I work in heavy equipment transport, my shift starts at 3:30 a.m. My routine is mechanical. Wake up, avoid looking into the dark woods through the floor-to-ceiling windows, and leave by 2:45 a.m. Lily, who works freelance, usually stays buried under the duvet until the sun is safely up. The heavy thud of the front door is her safe signal. It tells her I'm gone and the house is locked. On the Tuesday of the incident, everything felt routine until I reached the staging yard. I had just climbed into my rig when my phone vibrated. It was Lily. "Hey," she whispered. Her voice was so thin it barely registered over the idling diesel engine. "Why did you come back? Did you forget your logbook?" A cold needle of adrenaline shot through my chest. "Lily, I'm at the yard. I've been gone for 45 minutes. What are you talking about?" There was a silence so heavy I could hear her breathing hitch. "The door," she stammered. "The front door slammed 5 minutes ago. I heard your work boots. I heard someone walking toward the kitchen. They're opening the drawers, Elias." I didn't waste time. I told her to lock the bedroom door and crawl under the bed. I didn't call the local sheriff. The response time to our coordinates is usually 30 minutes on a good day. Instead, I called our neighbor, Silas, a retired park ranger who lived half a mile down the road and kept a shotgun by his bed for coyotes. The following is what happened from Lily's perspective. After she hung up, she heard the footsteps leave the kitchen. They weren't the hurried, frantic steps of a burglar. They were rhythmic, heavy, and deliberate. Thud, thud, thud. They stopped right outside the bedroom door. She watched the shadows move in the gap at the bottom of the door. Someone was standing there, perfectly still. Then, the clicking started. It wasn't a doorknob turning. It sounded like metal tapping against metal, like someone was dragging a ring or a key along the doorframe. This lasted for 3 minutes, just a slow, metallic tink, tink, tink. Silas arrived 6 minutes later. Lily heard his truck roar into the gravel driveway, his high beams flooding the house with artificial daylight. She heard him shout, "State your business!" followed by the unmistakable rack of a 12-gauge shotgun. Then, silence. I arrived 10 minutes after Silas. When I pulled up, Silas was standing on the porch, looking genuinely baffled. The front door was wide open, but the deadbolt hadn't been picked or forced. It was simply unlocked. We searched every inch of that house. We checked the pantry, the crawl space, and the attic hatch. Nothing. But here is where it gets illogical for a standard robbery. Nothing of value was taken. My laptop was on the kitchen table. Lily's jewelry box was in plain sight. However, when we went into the kitchen, every single drawer was pulled out to its maximum length, arranged like a set of stairs. And on the kitchen counter, someone had laid out a single, perfectly circular ring of raw meat taken from our freezer, surrounding my spare set of house keys. The most unsettling part? Silas had been watching the only road in and out from his porch before he got my call. He hadn't seen a single car or person pass by. The house was surrounded by soft, damp mud from the previous night's rain. We found Silas's boot prints, and we found my tracks from earlier that morning. But around the perimeter of the house, near the glass walls where the intruder would have had to enter, there wasn't a single footprint. No scuff marks, no disturbed pine needles. Just a pristine, untouched circle of mud. Lily refuses to stay in that house alone now. We're breaking the lease next month. The police eventually told us they'd had similar reports from hikers in the redwoods. Stories of someone or something that mimics the sounds of familiar people to get inside, only to leave strange, symbolic arrangements in their kitchens. I don't know what opened our door that night, but the thought of it standing outside the bedroom, tapping its fingers against the frame while Lily hid, is enough to make me quit the night shift for good. I've never been a fan of the silence that follows a long shift, especially when that silence is situated less than 200 yards from the state penitentiary. I live in a small, weathered bungalow that my grandfather built back when the prison was just a single brick block. Now it's a sprawling fortress of concrete, barbed wire, and humdrum misery. People always ask if I'm afraid of a breakout. I usually tell them that the walls are designed to keep people in, not let them out. But lately, I've started to realize that the walls don't stop the sound. It started about 3 weeks ago. I work as a freelance archivist, which means I'm often up until 2 or 3 a.m., surrounded by the glow of 3 monitors and the low hum of an air conditioner. The first night, it was a rhythmic thwack. It sounded like someone hitting a wet rug against a tree trunk. It was dull, heavy, and spaced exactly 4 seconds apart. At first, I blamed the wind, or perhaps a loose shutter on the old garage. I ignored it. But then the sound changed. It became a metallic scraping, like a heavy chain being dragged over gravel, followed by a sharp, choked-off whistle. In the original stories you hear about this area, people talk about ghosts of inmates or the wind in the watchtowers. But this felt physical. It felt close. Logic tells you that if someone had escaped, the sirens would be wailing. The searchlights would be cutting through my backyard. But the prison remained silent, its perimeter lights glowing an eerie, sickly orange. My house sits at the end of a dead-end street, separated from the prison's outer fence by a dense strip of overgrown scrub oak and a dry creek bed. One Tuesday night, the noise escalated. It wasn't just scraping anymore. It was a conversation. Or, at least, the cadence of one. I heard a low, guttural murmur coming from the edge of my property, followed by that same thwack. I decided to do something stupid. I turned off all the lights in my house, grabbed a heavy MacLeod, not to turn it on, but to use as a club, and stepped out onto my back porch. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and ozone. The scraping sound started again, coming from the dry creek bed. Shh, thud. Shh, thud. I crept down the porch steps, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I didn't use the flashlight. I waited for my eyes to adjust to the orange haze reflecting off the prison walls. As I reached the line of scrub oaks, I saw them. There were no orange jumpsuits, no desperate fugitives. There were 3 men. They were dressed in dark, heavy work clothes, the kind utility workers wear. But they had no truck, no tools, and no reflective gear. They were standing in a circle around a concrete drainage pipe that led directly under the prison's outer perimeter fence. One man was holding a long, rusted steel rod. He was sliding it into the pipe. Shh, and then letting it drop. Thud. The logic of a burglary didn't fit. You don't make that much noise if you're trying to be Dewey. And then I heard what they were saying. One of them leaned into the pipe and whispered, but his voice carried in the still night air. "The weight is set. Shift 3. Don't look at the light." A voice replied from inside the pipe. It was a hollow, metallic echo that didn't sound human. It sounded like a recording being played at half speed. "The weight is acknowledged. We are breathing the same air now." A cold sweat broke out across my neck. This wasn't an escape attempt. It looked like a ritual or some kind of bizarre smuggling operation involving something far more sinister than contraband. Suddenly, the man with the steel rod stopped. He didn't turn around, but he tilted his head as if sniffing the air. "The observer is standing by the yoke," he said calmly. I didn't wait. I turned and bolted back to the house, my lungs burning. I locked the back door, then the deadbolt, then the chain. I moved to the window and peeled back the curtain just an inch. The creek bed was empty. No men, no steel rod, just the oppressive orange glow of the prison. I called the police, but I didn't tell them about ghosts or shadows. I told them there were trespassers tampering with the drainage system near the south wall. When the cruiser arrived 20 minutes later, the officers checked the area with high-powered spots. They found the drainage pipe, but it was capped with a heavy iron grate that looked like it hadn't been touched in 20 years. The rust was thick and undisturbed. There were no footprints in the dirt, only the tracks of my own frantic retreat. One of the officers looked at me with a mix of pity and annoyance. "The prison has a vibration sensor system, son. If anyone was banging steel rods against those pipes, the whole block would be on lockdown. You're just hearing the pressure release from the old steam tunnels." I wanted to believe him. I really did. But the next night, as I sat in my dark office, the scraping started again. Shh, thud. And then a new sound, a soft, rhythmic tapping on my office window. I didn't look. I haven't looked since. I've put the house on the market, but who wants to buy a home where the silence of the prison is louder than the city itself? Every night I hear that hollow, metallic voice in my head. We are breathing the same air now. I realized then that the logic of the prison is flawed. The walls aren't there to keep people in. They are there to make sure we don't see who or what is coming out to meet us in the dark. I've spent a decade driving long-haul routes across the Midwest, and I've learned to distinguish the specific patterns of night driving. You recognize the rhythmic flicker of reflective markers, the hazy glow of distant gas stations, and, most importantly, the authority of law enforcement lights. But 3 months ago, on a desolate stretch of Highway 47, I realized that authority can be easily mimicked by someone with enough patience and a lack of conscience. It was roughly 1:15 a.m. I was pushing my sedan toward the state line, aiming to reach a motel before the fatigue became dangerous. The road was a ribbon of black asphalt flanked by endless fields of dormant corn. There were no other travelers. When a pair of headlights appeared in my rearview mirror, I didn't think much of it. I maintained my cruise control, expecting them to overtake me. Instead, the vehicle surged forward, closing the gap until they were mere inches from my bumper. Then, the roof rack erupted in a violent display of red and blue. My immediate instinct was to pull over. I slowed down, drifting onto the narrow gravel shoulder. The patrol car followed, but it didn't park directly behind me in the standard offset position used by state troopers to protect themselves from traffic. It pulled up alongside my driver's side door, angled inward, effectively pinning my car between their chassis and a steep drainage ditch. I rolled my window down just an inch. The vehicle was a late-model SUV, painted a matte charcoal gray. There were no decals, no precinct numbers, and the light bar on top looked strangely plastic, like something bought from an aftermarket warehouse. A man stepped out. He wasn't wearing a standard-issue uniform. He had on a dark tactical vest over a plain black hoodie. He carried a heavy-duty flashlight, but he didn't aim it at my mirrors or my hands. He kept the beam fixed directly on my eyes, blinding me completely. "License and registration," he said. His voice was flat, devoid of the professional cadence of an officer. It felt rehearsed, like a line from a low-budget film. "Is there a problem, officer?" I asked, my hand hovering near the door lock. "I was set to cruise control. I wasn't speeding." He didn't answer. He reached out and gripped the top of my window, pulling on the glass as if testing its strength. "Step out of the vehicle. I need to inspect your trunk. We've had reports of a silver sedan matching this description involved in a hit and run." My car is navy blue. Even in the dim orange glow of my dashboard, the color is unmistakable. "I'm not getting out," I said, my voice remarkably steady despite the cold knot forming in my stomach. "This isn't a marked unit. If you want me to exit, please call for a supervisor or a secondary marked cruiser." The man's posture shifted. He stopped pulling at the glass and leaned his weight against my door. Through the glare of his flashlight, I saw his other hand move toward his belt. He wasn't reaching for a radio or handcuffs. He was fumbling with something heavy and metallic that didn't look like a standard sidearm. I didn't wait for him to find what he was looking for. I shifted the car into drive and floored the accelerator. Because he had angled his SUV to pin me, my front fender scraped harshly against his wheel well, but the momentum carried me forward. I didn't look back until I was a quarter-mile down the road. The red and blue lights were still on, but they weren't following me. They remained stationary on the shoulder. I dialed 911 immediately. The dispatcher's response was the most chilling part of the night. She informed me that there were no patrol units, marked or unmarked, within 30 miles of Highway 47. She told me to keep driving until I reached the county sheriff's office and warned me not to stop for any lights until I saw a brick-and-mortar station. When I arrived at the station, a deputy inspected my car. He pointed to the scrape on my driver's side door. It wasn't just paint transfer. There were deep, jagged gouges in the metal, and stuck in the trim was a fragment of a magnetic strobe light, the kind you can plug into a cigarette lighter. "You're the third one this week," the deputy told me as he took my statement. "They aren't looking for a hit-and-run suspect. They're looking for people who travel alone. They use the lights because they know most people are conditioned to obey." The logic of the situation haunts me. A real officer would have chased me. A real officer would have radioed ahead. That man just stayed there in the dark, waiting for the next set of headlights to appear on the horizon. I don't drive Highway 47 anymore. And now, whenever I see those red and blue lights in my mirror, my first instinct isn't to feel safe. It's to wonder if the person behind the wheel is wearing a uniform or just a black hoodie and a tactical vest bought online. I keep my windows up, my doors locked, and I never, ever stop until I see the station. Most people believe that the most dangerous encounters in a city involve shadows or hidden weapons. But after my experience last November, I've realized that the most terrifying thing you can face is a person who weaponizes the truth in broad daylight. I was finishing a late-night grocery run at a 24-hour supermarket on the edge of the industrial district. The lot was an expansive desert of cracked asphalt, illuminated by flickering sodium lamps that cast everything in a sickly, jaundiced yellow. I was pushing my cart toward my car, a modest silver hatchback, when I noticed a man leaning against the driver's side door. He was dressed in a high-quality wool coat that seemed out of place in this neighborhood. Beside him sat a high-end electric scooter, the kind that costs more than a used motorcycle. As I approached, I maintained a neutral expression, assuming he was just resting. But as I reached for my keys, he straightened up. His face wasn't twisted in anger. It was set in a mask of calm, cold disappointment. "You took your time," he said. It wasn't a question. "I'm sorry," I replied, stopping a few feet away. "You're leaning on my car." He gestured to the scooter. "This belongs to my son. He's 10 years old. He's currently at the clinic because someone in a silver hatchback clipped him 3 blocks away and drove off without looking back. He managed to memorize the dent on your rear fender before he collapsed." I looked at my fender. There was a dent there, yes, one I had acquired 6 months ago when I backed into a concrete pillar in my own driveway. My heart began to skip beats, not out of guilt, but out of a sudden, sharp realization of the trap being laid. "I've been here for 40 minutes, I said, my voice tight. "I haven't moved this car since I arrived. You can check the store's security cameras." The man smiled, but the expression didn't reach his eyes. He pulled a smartphone from his pocket and tapped the screen.
"The cameras in this section of the lot have been out of commission for a week. I checked before I sat down. And as for your timeline, witnesses are very unreliable when faced with a grieving father and a bloodied child." There was no child. There were no sirens. There was only this man and his expensive prop. The logic of a typical robbery involves a demand for a wallet or a phone. But this was different. He wasn't asking for money, yet. He was building a narrative. He was looking for a crack in my composure, a moment of hesitation where I would offer him compensation just to make the accusation go away. "I'm calling the police," I said, reaching into my pocket. "Go ahead," he countered, his posture remaining disturbingly relaxed. "I'll tell them you attempted to bribe me to stay silent. I'll tell them I smelled alcohol on your breath. Who do you think they'll believe? The man with the ruined scooter and the injured boy, or the driver who tried to flee the scene of a crime?" I realized then that this was a professional. He wasn't a crazy person on the street. He was a predator who specialized in social engineering. He knew that the fear of a ruined reputation is often more potent than the fear of physical violence. I didn't dial 911 immediately. Instead, I stepped back and looked at the scooter. I noticed a small plastic tag hanging from the handlebars, a rental agency label. "That's a rental," I pointed out. "If your son owned it, it wouldn't have a GPS-locked commercial tag on the stem. And if there was an accident, the rental company would have received a tilt sensor alert and dispatched a recovery team. None of those things have happened." The mask of the grieving father didn't slip. It evaporated. His face went completely blank, losing all traces of emotion. He looked at the tag, then back at me. The silence between us was heavy, a physical weight in the cold night air. He didn't argue. He didn't shout. He simply picked up the scooter, Folded it with a practiced motion, and began walking away toward the dark perimeter of the lot. He didn't look back. He didn't offer a parting threat. He simply ceased to be a character in my life as quickly as he had entered it. I stood by my car for a long time, watching his silhouette disappear into the shadows of the industrial warehouses. I didn't feel relief. I felt a profound sense of violation. He hadn't touched me, yet he had managed to make the very ground beneath my feet feel unstable. When I finally got into my car, I checked my dash cam. To my horror, I realized the memory card was full and had stopped recording 2 days prior. He had been right about the store cameras, too. I asked the manager the next day, and they confirmed the entire north lot was a blind spot. He had chosen the location, the victim, and the story with surgical precision. The logic of the world tells us that the truth will set us free. But that night taught me that the truth is just another tool that can be twisted, reshaped, and used to pin you against your own car in a dark parking lot. I don't go to that supermarket anymore. And whenever I see a silver hatchback with a dented fender, I wonder if the driver knows how easily that mark could be turned into a confession. There is a specific kind of vulnerability that only exists at 2 a.m. in a self-service gas station. It's the kind of place that feels like a brightly lit island surrounded by an ocean of impenetrable dark. I was driving back from a double shift, my fuel light glowing like a warning ember on my dashboard, when I pulled into a station near the old rail yards. My friend Marcus was asleep in the passenger seat, his head leaning against the cold glass of the window. I stepped out of the car. The air was stagnant, carrying the sharp chemical scent of gasoline and old asphalt. I swiped my card, the screen flickering with a dull greenish light. That was when I noticed him. He didn't approach from the street. He emerged from behind the stack of windshield washer fluid jugs near the main entrance. He was dressed in layers of heavy, grease-stained denim, his movements slow and deliberate. He wasn't staggering or acting like someone under the influence of a substance. He moved with a terrifying, sober precision. He stopped exactly 6 feet away from me. In his right hand, he held a piece of sharpened rebar, wrapped at one end with thick electrical tape. It wasn't hidden. He held it at his side, the jagged tip pointed toward my front tire. "I'm not looking for trouble," he said. His voice was a low, dry rasp that barely carried through the air. "I'm looking for a contribution to my travel fund." "I don't carry cash," I replied, my hand tightening on the fuel nozzle. It was a lie, but a reflexive one. The man didn't blink. He looked at Marcus, who was still dead to the world in the passenger seat, then back at me. "Your friend looks like a heavy sleeper. It would be a shame if he woke up to the smell of gasoline and a flat tire. Or worse." The logic of a typical mugging involves a quick demand and an even quicker escape. But this man wasn't in a hurry. He was standing in the middle of a well-lit station, holding a weapon, as if he knew that no one was coming to help.
I looked toward the glass booth of the station. It was empty. The overnight attendant was likely in the back or hadn't shown up for their shift. "I have $20 in the center console," I said, trying to keep my breathing rhythmic. "I'll reach in and get it. Just keep the metal away from the car." He tilted his head. "Slowly, and leave the phone on the seat." As I leaned into the car, I debated waking Marcus. But Marcus is the type of person who reacts with his fists before his brain. If he saw the rebar, he'd lunged, and in the cramped space of the front seat, that rebar would find a home in someone's ribs before the fight even started. I grabbed the $20 bill and stepped back out, leaving the door slightly ajar. I held the bill out. The man didn't reach for it with his hand. He gestured for me to drop it on the oil-stained concrete. "Now," he said, his eyes tracking the movement of a distant pair of headlights on the overpass. "The watch." "The watch wasn't part of the travel fund," I said, my pulse thrumming in my fingertips. He raised the rebar just an inch. The light from the overhead canopy glinted off the rusted surface of the metal. "The watch is the interest on your delay." At that moment, a heavy black SUV pulled into the station at the far end, near the air compressors. It didn't stop to get gas. It just sat there, its engine idling, its tinted windows reflecting the station's lights. The man with the rebar didn't look surprised. He signaled toward the SUV with a slight nod of his head. I realized then that this wasn't a lone beggar. This was a coordinated effort. He was the bait, the one who engaged the victim, while the SUV served as the backup or the getaway. If I fought him, I wasn't just fighting one man with a piece of steel. I was fighting an unknown number of people in that vehicle. I unbuckled the strap of my watch and let it fall onto the $20 bill. "Finish your fuel," the man said. He bent down, scooped up the money and the watch with a fluid motion, and began walking toward the black SUV. He didn't run. He walked with the confidence of someone who owned the night. I shoved the nozzle back into the pump, jumped into the car, and locked the doors. The click of the locks felt like the most beautiful thing I had ever heard. I shifted into gear and peeled out of the station, heading in the opposite direction of the SUV. Marcus woke up as we hit the on-ramp to the highway. "Hey," he mumbled, rubbing his eyes.
"Did we get gas?" "Yeah," I said, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. "We got gas." I didn't tell him what happened. I didn't call the police until I was miles away and behind the locked door of my own apartment. The logic of the night is different than the logic of the day. During the day, you think you'd be a hero. At 2 a.m., under the hum of a flickering gas station light, you realize that your life is worth more than a watch and a $20 bill. I still have a phantom weight on my wrist where that watch used to be. And I never, under any circumstances, stop for gas after midnight. Even if the light is glowing red, I keep driving until the sun comes up.
There is a specific weight to the silence of a rural morning, especially when you are used to the mechanical groans of a diesel engine warming up. My father owned a 1994 heavy-duty pickup, a rusted behemoth of steel that had been the permanent centerpiece of our gravel driveway for as long as I could remember. It was more than a vehicle. It was a landmark. You knew you were home when you saw that dull crimson hood reflecting the porch light. On a Thursday in mid-October, that landmark vanished. I didn't wake up to a theft. There was no evidence of glass shards on the gravel, no drag marks from a tow truck, and the gate at the end of our half-mile drive was still locked from the inside with the heavy grade 8 chain. My father was standing on the porch, his coffee mug forgotten on the railing, staring at the empty rectangular patch of dry ground where the truck had been parked for 15 years. "I didn't hear a thing, Elias," he said, his voice devoid of its usual grit. "I was awake at 4 a.m. I watched the sun come up. That truck was there when the sky was gray. Now the sky is blue, and the space is empty." The logic of a stolen vehicle implies a motive, parts, resale, or a joyride, but our driveway is surrounded by soft marshland and a single, narrow access road. To move that truck without a key, you would need a flatbed and a winching system that would have been impossible to operate in total silence. I walked out to the spot. The ground was bone dry, but the patch of dirt where the truck usually sat was different. It was colder than the surrounding gravel. I knelt down and pressed my palm to the earth. It felt like touching the interior of a cellar. "Did Mom take it?" I asked, though I knew the answer. My mother hadn't driven a manual transmission in 20 years. "She's in the kitchen," my father replied. "She thinks I moved it to the barn. But the barn is locked, and I have the only set of keys in my pocket." We spent the morning performing a frantic, silent search of the property. We checked the tree line, the old creek bed, and the equipment shed. Nothing. The truck hadn't just been moved, it had been erased. Around noon, the local deputy arrived. He was a man who had grown up in this county and knew every vehicle on every farm. He stood in the driveway, scratching his chin as he looked at the empty space. "You're sure it was here this morning, Frank?" the deputy asked. "I touched the door handle when I went out to check the mail at dawn," my father insisted. "It was cold. It was real." The deputy walked to the edge of the driveway, looking at the soft mud near the gate. "Here's the problem, Frank. There are no tire tracks leading out. In fact, there are no tracks at all. Not even the ones your truck should have made when you parked it there 3 days ago. It's like the gravel hasn't been disturbed in weeks." I looked down. He was right. The gravel was perfectly level, showing no signs of the heavy tread marks that a 3-ton vehicle should leave. The logic of physics was beginning to unravel. The afternoon brought a heavy, oppressive fog that rolled in from the marshes. We sat on the porch, the three of us, watching the empty spot. The tension wasn't about the loss of the truck, it was about the void it had left behind. At 6 p.m., my mother pointed a trembling finger toward the driveway. "Look at the light," she whispered. The sun was setting, casting long orange shadows across the yard. In the exact spot where the truck should have been, the shadow was wrong.
The sun was hitting the gravel directly, but a dark, rectangular silhouette was stretching across the ground, as if an invisible object was blocking the light. It wasn't a ghost. It was a lack of light in the shape of a 1994 pickup. I walked toward the shadow. As I entered the darkened area, the temperature dropped significantly. I reached out my hand, expecting to feel cold steel or the rough texture of the crimson paint. My fingers met nothing but empty air. Yet my hand disappeared into the darkness of the shadow, obscured by an object that wasn't physically there. My father joined me. He reached into the void where the driver's side door should be. He mimicked the motion of turning a handle. His hand stayed suspended in mid-air, hidden by the silhouette. Then he leaned his weight forward. He didn't fall. He leaned against the empty air as if he were resting his shoulder against a solid cab. We didn't call the police back. What would we say? That we had a ghost of a machine? That night, we stayed inside with the curtains drawn. We didn't talk about the insurance or the replacement. We just sat in the living room, listening to the wind press against the house. The next morning, the truck was back. It sat in the exact same spot, the engine ticking as if it had just been turned off. The crimson paint was covered in a layer of fine gray dust that didn't match the soil of our county. My father walked out, his face pale, and opened the door. On the driver's seat sat a single item that hadn't been there before. A small, smooth stone from a beach hundreds of miles away. The logic of the world returned, but the landmark was tainted. We sold the truck a week later to a scrapyard in the next state. My father never bought another one. Now, when I look at that patch of gravel, I don't see a vehicle. I see a place where the world once opened up and took something away, only to return it with a warning that some things are never truly gone. They are just waiting in the shadows.
Inheriting a lease from a distant relative often feels like a bargain, until you realize you've also inherited their obsession. When I moved into the Victorian-style townhouse on the edge of the city, the only piece of furniture the previous tenant insisted on leaving was a towering mahogany grandfather clock situated at the turn of the narrow second-floor hallway. It was a massive, silent sentinel with a tarnished brass face and weights that looked like skeletal fingers. The relative told me the clock hadn't functioned since the late 70s. The internal gears were seized by rust, and the pendulum was locked in place with a heavy silk cord. I saw no reason to move it. It added a certain gravitas to the hallway, a sense of history that my modern IKEA bookshelves lacked. The first week was uneventful, but on the 8th night, the logic of the house began to shift. I was working at my desk in the spare room when I noticed the light in the hallway looked different. Usually, the spill from my doorway illuminated the clock's face clearly. Now, the light seemed to be absorbed before it reached the mahogany casing. I stepped into the hall and realized the pendulum was no longer tied. The silk cord lay on the floor, perfectly coiled, as if it had been placed there by hand. The pendulum wasn't moving. Not yet. I checked the time on my phone. 11:42 p.m. I looked at the brass face of the clock. The hands were set to 12 o'clock. I assumed it was a mechanical fluke. Perhaps the house had settled, or a vibration from the nearby subway had loosened the cord. I picked up the silk, tied the pendulum back to its anchor, and went to bed. When I woke up at 7 a.m., the hallway felt cold. A dry, deep cold that didn't match the heating settings of the house. I walked past the clock on my way to the bathroom. The silk cord was gone. Not on the floor, not in the hallway. The pendulum was free, hanging perfectly still. I looked at the clock's face. 11:43 p.m. The minute hand had moved exactly one notch. My phone, however, insisted it was morning. I felt a slight vertigo, a disconnect between what I saw and what I knew to be true. I tried to move the minute hand manually, but it was immobile, as if welded to the brass backing. Throughout the following day, I checked the clock every hour. It didn't move while I was watching, but every time I turned my back, every time I left the hallway for more than a few minutes, the hand progressed. By 4 p.m. in the real world, the clock read 11:50 p.m. The logic of a haunted object usually involves a ghost or a spirit, but this felt more like a predatory mechanism. The clock wasn't just telling time, it was counting down to something. I decided to stay in the hallway that evening. I brought a chair, a thermos of coffee, and a book. I sat directly opposite the mahogany casing. I watched the pendulum. I watched the brass hands. For 4 hours, nothing happened. The clock stayed at 11:55 p.m. My legs grew cramped, and the silence of the house became a physical pressure against my eardrums. Around 2 a.m. by my phone's clock, I felt a heavy wave of lethargy. My eyelids became leaden. I didn't fall asleep, but I blinked. A long, slow blink that couldn't have lasted more than a second. When my eyes opened, the hallway had changed. My chair was gone. I was standing, pressed against the opposite wall. The clock read 11:59 p.m. The most disturbing part wasn't the time. It was the reflection in the glass casing of the clock. In the dark wood and the polished glass, I could see the hallway behind me. But in the reflection, the hallway was filled with furniture I didn't recognize. Heavy velvet curtains, a different rug, and a woman in a high-collared dress standing just inches behind my shoulder. I didn't turn around. I knew with a terrifying certainty that if I turned around, the logic of the hallway would reset to the reflection's reality. I kept my eyes fixed on the clock's minute hand. It was trembling, struggling to make that final leap to the midnight mark. I reached out, not to the hands, but to the pendulum. I grabbed the heavy brass weight and pulled it to the side, forcing it into a swing. As the pendulum moved, the air in the hallway felt like it was being sucked through a straw. The reflection in the glass shattered, not the physical glass itself, but the image within it. The woman, the velvet curtains, and the foreign hallway dissolved into a blur of mahogany and shadow. The minute hand snapped back, not to 12, but all the way back to the morning hour, 7 a.m. I didn't wait for a second round. I didn't even pack a bag. I left the townhouse that night and checked into a motel. When I returned 2 days later with a professional moving crew, the clock was gone. There was no mark on the floor where it had stood for decades, no dust silhouette. I called the relative who had leased me the house. They seemed confused.
"What clock, Elias? I told you the house was unfurnished. We cleared everything out in the 70s.
I looked at the silk cord I had kept in my pocket. It wasn't silk anymore. It was a strand of gray, aged hair braided tightly into a loop. I don't keep clocks in my new apartment. I rely on the digital glow of my phone and the natural transit of the sun. People think I'm eccentric for not having a timepiece on the wall, but they don't understand the danger of a mechanical interval. They don't realize that some clocks aren't there to measure time. They are there to invite it back in, 1 minute at a time, until the reflection becomes the reality. Remodeling an estate in the high desert of Nevada is less about aesthetics and more about endurance. I had been contracted to gut a sprawling ranch-style property that had sat abandoned since the late 90s. The air inside was thick with the scent of sawdust and ancient insulation. My client, a developer from out of state,
wanted the place stripped to the studs in 3 weeks. I was working alone. It was a cost-saving measure that I had begun to regret by the 4th day. The house had a peculiar layout. It was built around a central courtyard that remained perpetually in shadow, and the basement was a labyrinth of narrow corridors that didn't seem to serve any architectural purpose. The original story mentioned strange markings in the attic, but what I found was more grounded and, frankly, more disturbing. On the first Tuesday, the power went out. Not the whole neighborhood, just my site. I checked the breaker box in the garage and found that every single switch had been flipped to the off position. There was no one else in the house. I had the only key, and the security perimeter I'd set up showed no breaches. I flipped them back, chalked it up to a fluke of the old wiring, and returned to the master suite. 10 minutes later, the switches flipped again. I didn't reach for my phone immediately. I grabbed my heavy framing hammer and walked back to the garage. The air was perfectly still. As I reached the breaker box, I noticed something new. There was a smear of dark, oily residue on the metal casing, the kind of grease you find on the undercarriage of a truck. It was a fresh thumbprint. I decided to stop for the day, but when I went to collect my tools from the basement, I realized the logic of the renovation had been compromised. I had spent the morning removing the drywall in the lower hall. I had stacked the boards neatly against the far wall. Now, the boards were gone.
In their place stood a series of makeshift partitions made from plastic sheeting and duct tape, creating a narrow funnel that led toward the back of the foundation. I didn't remember building those. I didn't remember bringing plastic sheeting into the basement. I moved toward the exit, but the stairs were no longer where I had left them. This isn't a ghost story about shifting rooms. It was a matter of perspective. Someone had hung heavy black tarps over the stairwell opening, blending it perfectly with the shadows of the ceiling. It was a deliberate attempt to disorient me, to keep me in the dark. I reached for my flashlight. The beam cut through the dust, reflecting off a pair of eyes at the end of the corridor. They weren't glowing or supernatural. They were human eyes, wide and unblinking, peering through a slit in the plastic sheeting. "I'm working here," I said, my voice echoing flatly against the concrete. "The police are on their way." The figure didn't move. It didn't speak. It simply withdrew into the darkness behind the plastic. I didn't chase them. I climbed the stairs, tearing through the tarps, and burst into the main living area. I grabbed my jacket and headed for the front door. It was locked from the outside. The deadbolt, which required a key from both sides, had been engaged while I was in the basement. I turned toward the large bay windows. I expected to see a stranger standing in the yard. Instead, I saw my own truck, which I had parked in the driveway, now idling near the edge of the property line. The driver's side door was wide open, and the interior light was casting a pale glow onto the gravel. I broke the window with a chair and jumped out, ignoring the sting of the glass on my palms. I ran to the truck. It was empty. The keys were still in the ignition, but the seat had been pushed all the way forward, far closer than I ever sit. On the dashboard, someone had placed a small, jagged piece of copper pipe that I recognized from the basement plumbing. It was stained with something dark. I drove until I reached the highway patrol station. When the deputies returned with me to the house, they found the garage breakers flipped to off once again. They searched the basement and found a crawl space behind the water heater that I hadn't noticed. Inside was a sleeping bag, a collection of my own discarded lunch wrappers, and a notebook filled with detailed sketches of my daily routine, what time I arrived, when I took my breaks, and exactly how long I spent in the basement. The horror wasn't a haunting.
It was the realization that I had been working alongside someone for 4 days. They had been in the walls, moving the drywall, watching me through the gaps in the studs, and learning the rhythm of my hammer. The developer tried to get me to finish the job, offering a bonus for the inconvenience. I declined. I left my heavy tools there, the saws, the drills, the ladders. It wasn't worth going back inside. Now, when I take a contract for a renovation, I never work alone. And the first thing I do isn't checking the plumbing or the roof. I check for the spaces between the walls. I check for the greasy thumbprints on the breaker box. Because the most terrifying thing about a house under repair isn't what's being fixed. It's what's been living in the wreckage while you weren't looking. The transition to parenthood brings a heightened state of alertness that borders on paranoia. When my wife Claire and I moved into the refurbished textile mill on the riverfront, we were enamored by the high ceilings and the industrial charm. However, the building was a hollow shell of brick and steel, and the acoustics were unpredictable. Our daughter, Maya, was 6 months old, and like most new parents, our lifeline to her well-being was a high-end digital baby monitor with a night vision camera and a two-way intercom. The monitor sat on my nightstand, its small screen glowing with a grainy, obsidian-hued feed of the nursery. For the first few months, it was a source of comfort. But as autumn set in and the building's heating pipes began to expand and contract, the device started to behave in a manner that defied its digital encryption. One Friday evening, Claire was at a late shift at the hospital. I was in the living room, reading a manuscript, with the monitor receiver clipped to my belt. The nursery was at the far end of the long, narrow hallway. The building was unusually still, the kind of silence that makes you aware of your own pulse. I glanced at the screen. Maya was a motionless silhouette in her crib. But then, the video feed flickered. The graininess shifted, and for a split second, the image didn't show the nursery. It showed a different room entirely. A kitchen I didn't recognize, dimly lit by a single overhead bulb. I shook the device, assuming it was a glitch or a cross signal from a neighbor's unit. The image snapped back to Maya's room. I brushed it off. Logic suggested that in a building with 40 units, some overlap was inevitable, even with encrypted signals. An hour later, I was preparing for bed. I placed the monitor on the nightstand. The screen was dark, but the signal light was green. Then, the status bar for the intercom began to move. It indicated that someone was speaking into the nursery unit. I held the device to my ear.
I didn't hear a voice. I heard the rhythmic movement of air, the steady, heavy exhale of someone standing very close to the microphone. It wasn't the shallow breathing of an infant. It was deep, deliberate, and adult. I looked at the screen. The room was empty. Maya hadn't moved. The door was closed. I walked down the hallway, my footsteps muffled by the heavy rug. I didn't turn on the lights. I pushed the nursery door open. The room was cold, the window was locked, and my daughter was deep in sleep. I checked the closet and behind the rocking chair. Nothing. I returned to my room, convinced that the monitor was picking up a signal from another apartment. I decided to turn the unit off for the night, but as my finger reached for the power button, the screen illuminated again. This time, the camera angle was different. It wasn't the high-angle view from the bookshelf. The perspective was low, as if the camera had been placed on the floor, looking up toward our bed. I could see the edge of our duvet and my own hand reaching for the monitor. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The monitor hadn't switched signals with a neighbor. Someone had accessed the internal network of the device. Someone was watching me from within my own bedroom, using the very tool I bought for protection. I didn't panic. I didn't shout. I slowly lowered the monitor and scanned the room. Our bedroom is large, with several deep-set wardrobes and a heavy velvet curtain covering the old freight elevator door that had been decommissioned decades ago. I saw a movement in the shadow of the curtain. It wasn't a ghost. It was the matte finish of a smartphone lens, protruding slightly from the gap in the fabric. I grabbed the heavy glass carafe from the nightstand and lunged toward the curtain. I didn't catch him. The freight elevator door, which I had assumed was bolted shut, swung open on silent, well-oiled hinges. I heard the friction of heavy cables moving in the shaft as the manual lift descended into the basement. I called the police, and then I called the building manager. When they inspected the freight elevator, they found that the lock had been bypassed weeks ago. Inside the lift car, there was a small folding stool and a series of printed photographs pinned to the walls. They were images of Claire, Maya, and me, taken from the perspective of our own baby monitor. The static I had heard wasn't a malfunction. It was the sound of a man sitting in a dark elevator shaft, just inches away from our bedroom wall, watching our lives through a hacked frequency. He had been there for hours every night, listening to our private conversations and studying our movements. We moved out the following week. We didn't take the monitor with us. We left it on the floor of the empty nursery, a hollow plastic eye watching an empty room. I still have a baby monitor in our new house, but it's an old-fashioned analog model with no camera and no internet connection. People tell me the digital ones are more secure, that the encryption is unbreakable. I don't argue with them. I just remember the graininess of that screen, the low-angle view of my own bed, and the weight of a gaze that didn't need a signal to reach me. The logic of technology is that it makes us safer. The logic of the dark is that every window you open for yourself is a window you open for someone else. I keep the curtains drawn now, and I never, ever trust the silence of a green light. There is a psychological threshold you cross when driving across the American Southwest at night. The vastness of the Mojave Desert ceases to be a landscape and becomes a void, a place where the distance between gas stations is measured not in miles, but in minutes of isolation. My wife, Sarah, and our 2-year-old son were packed into our aging SUV, moving our entire lives from the neon glare of Nevada to the humid pines of the Deep South. We had reached the stretch of Interstate 40 that cuts through the heart of New Mexico. It was roughly 3:30 a.m. Sarah was asleep against the window, and the only movement in the car was the steady rhythm of our son's breathing in the back seat. The logic of a long-distance drive suggests that the road is a shared space. But out there, you are the only witness to the darkness. That was until I noticed the single headlight. It appeared about 20 miles outside of Gallup. Initially, I thought it was a motorcycle, but the light was too high off the ground, and it didn't wobble or lean into the curves. It maintained a constant, unwavering distance from my rear bumper. I sped up to 80 miles per hour. The light matched my pace. I slowed to 60. It stayed pinned to my rear-view mirror like a parasitic star. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps it was a truck with a blown lamp or a local who knew the roads better than I did. But as we entered a section of the highway where the pavement was being resurfaced, the single headlight did something that defied highway etiquette. It didn't pass me. It moved onto the unpaved shoulder, kicking up clouds of invisible dust, and pulled alongside the passenger side of my car. I glanced over. The vehicle was an old primer gray sedan. It had no license plate on the front, and the passenger window was tinted so darkly it looked like a sheet of solid onyx. The single working headlight was aimed upward, vibrating slightly with the motion of the car. I didn't wake Sarah. I didn't want her to see the way the gray sedan was drifting toward our lane, inches from our side mirror. Then the driver of the sedan did something subtle. They didn't honk or gesture. They simply turned on their interior dome light. Inside the sedan, there was no driver.
or at least not one sitting in the seat. The car was being operated by someone sitting in the back, leaning forward with their arms stretched unnaturally long to reach the steering wheel. The front seats had been removed entirely. The person, if it was a person, was wearing a heavy, oversized parka with the hood pulled low, despite the desert heat still radiating from the asphalt. I felt a cold wash of dread settle in my stomach. I looked at the speedometer. We were doing 90 now. The gray sedan stayed perfectly parallel, the hood-covered figure in the back seat remaining motionless, their hidden face turned toward Sarah's sleeping form. I realized then that this wasn't a road rage incident. It was a study. They were looking at us, cataloging the contents of our lives packed into the cargo hold. I saw a sign for a rest area 3 miles ahead. The logic of safety dictates that you stay on the move, but I knew I couldn't outrun a vehicle that had no front seats and a driver who didn't need to look at the road. I needed witnesses. I needed the presence of other human beings. As I took the exit ramp at a dangerous speed, the gray sedan didn't follow. It didn't brake. It continued straight down the interstate, its single headlight gradually shrinking into a pinpoint of white light before vanishing into the horizon. I pulled into the rest area, parking under the brightest light I could find. There were a few semi-trucks idling in the distance, their orange marker lights providing a sense of reality that the highway had lacked. I sat there for an hour, my hands gripped so tightly on the wheel that my knuckles had gone white. When Sarah finally woke up,
She looked at the bright lights and the row of vending machines.
"Are we there yet?" she asked, her voice thick with sleep.
"Just taking a break," I said. I didn't tell her about the primer gray car. I didn't tell her about the figure in the back seat. We finished the move to Georgia without further incident. But months later, while I was washing the SUV in our new driveway, I found something tucked into the weather stripping of the passenger door. It was a small, hand-drawn map on a piece of greasy parchment. It didn't show the highway or the towns we had passed. It was a perfect, detailed floor plan of the house we had just moved into, the one in Georgia. The map had a small X marked in the corner of our son's nursery. The logic of a journey is that you leave one place to arrive at another. But I've come to understand that on the long, dark stretches of the American interior, you don't always leave everything behind. Sometimes something follows you, drifting alongside your car in the desert night, waiting for the dome light to reveal where you're going. I keep the security system armed now. I check the locks 3 times before bed, and whenever I see a vehicle with a single headlight in my mirror, I don't slow down. I don't look over. I just keep driving until the sun burns the shadows off the road.